Hello.
Hi guys, it's Lara here,
I'm Evelyn.
and you are listening to
Once Upon a Niger podcast.
it's episode 3.
Yay!
No, thanks to everyone who listened to our first 2 episodes, and we're always encouraging feedback, we're encouraging comments, how to improve, but as always, we're committed to bringing these conversations and enlightening ourselves and our audience about Nigerian history.
Yeah, and so we're just here, we're gonna have a chat, chinwag, catch up, gist about some more key figures in Nigeria's history. In our previous episodes, we were speaking about General Sani Abacha, and we spoke about the dictator military regime and the harshness of it all, and we raised some really important prominent figures that were around during Abacha's time. Those figures were
Ken Saro-Wiwa and MKO Abiola and a few others, but I think those were the 2 main ones we kind of highlighted. I mean, there was Obasanjo, there's Wole Soyinka, there's Tai Solari, there is Dele Giwa. There were so many people,
And we'll definitely need to get into like the women of.
Oh, most definitely.
We definitely need to get into that. Let's not forget the women of Nigeria.
Fela Kuti's mother.
Absolutely,
Actually, yes.
Today, we're going to focus on Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was an environmental activist who was tragically murdered. Executed by the Abacha regime along 8 others. And we'll be delving into that a little bit more.
Yeah, so, I mean, like you rightly said, Ken Saro-Wiwa was an activist. He was a very prominent figure, very outspoken at the time of Abacha's regime about the exploitation of the people of Ogoni land. So, I mean, just to do like a quick brief on who Ken Saro-Wiwa himself was. So, I mean, back in the days, as with a lot of young Nigerians, he went to university, he was educated around the post-independent, or just before independent, and around Biafra time. He was an administrator in like the government, and when Biafra was happening, he wasn't really fully in support of it, and I think
the Biafran War was the Nigerian Civil War for listeners who are unaware.
That's right. So Ken Saro-Wiwa was, it was working in like the Delta area around, River State, and Ken wasn't apparently the story out there is that he wasn't in support of Biafra, because the reason why, one of the reasons that has been preferred for why Biafra started was because people felt cheated. They felt that the economic gains in the area were not actually being reflected in the people, how they lived, the environment and stuff like that. They felt like everything was sort of being pushed to the north, and that the northern people were sort of more in power, in control, even though the resources were not coming from their state. So it's almost like, well, you're going to come here, you're going to dig up the gold, you're going to dig up the oil, you're going to dig up the natural resources, but then you're going to spend the money, and we're going to be impoverished. But Ken felt like that wasn't, Biafra was not going to be the right approach and all that stuff. But anyway, so it was sort of like always in government in some shape or form. He was an administrator, but then he was sacked at some point for reasons that we're not going to delve into, not very significant for these purposes. But then he went into like publishing. He went into he started his own businesses. So he was like an entrepreneur, was a businessman. So he was wealthy, but his activism started being expressed through like the dramas that he was creating. So a lot of the stories he would tell and the articles he would publish were telling the stories of the oppression that people were feeling that was going on in the area, particularly in Ogoni land. And so that was how he kind of was thrust into he was from Ogoni land as well. It was a indigenous Ogoni land, so I guess it felt very strongly the pain of the people, and he was like very close to what was happening.
He felt it in himself. He was in pain, and he was a dear figure to the people.
Yeah.
So he did a lot of work to, well, Ken was a pain in Abacha side, but not only Abacha, he was a pain in the side of multinational corporate Shell, who are oil company, who did a lot of damage.
Yeah, let's talk about the damage. What is your understanding of like what Ken was fighting for?
So I've always when I think of like environmental damage in Nigeria, the Delta region is always something that comes up, and then it's like synonymous with Shell, and I see the Shell logo, and when I talk to family and friends, it's always about that region used to look so beautiful.
Yeah.
It was like a stunning area of Nigeria, but the images that I've seen of the area have just been they've been awful. Or it's black with oil. You hear about the health issues, the horrible health issues that local people have in the region because of the spills and gas flares that went on because of the drilling that Shell did in that area. And in preparation for this podcast, listening and researching about Ken Saro-Wiwa, it was it's been really fun again doing this research, because he's a really inspirational man, and I see a lot of ties with the work that he's done with, well, I guess it's a good reminder that researching and studying him is a good reminder that activism and campaigning for noble causes and being willing to risk one's life for worthy causes in Nigeria is not something that's like started like recently. When we think about, more recent protests like NSARS or like Bring Back Our Girls, Nigeria has a great history of like activism and people willing to put their life on the line. You always hear the triple joke that, please, I cannot come and die.
I can't come and kill myself.
But there are people who actually did.
Yeah.
They came and they died. And looking on his story and the risk him and the other Ogoni 8s were willing to take, and his children and the wives that survived these men, it fills my heart with like gratitude and hope. And those are my thoughts when I first think of
of Ken and Ogoni land. No, definitely, I totally hear you. And like, just to paint a picture of Ogoni land, like you started off talking about how beautiful it was prior to the devastation that happened and what's going on now. But essentially, it was just like a community that thrived on like the fishing industry and the farming, in the agriculture industry. And when oil was discovered, I feel like the discovery of oil has been the plague, the genesis of so many troubles in Nigeria. So oil was discovered in the 1950s. I think it was like maybe 1957 in Delta. And essentially, the usual way of exploiting the big multinationals, Shell, was the main Royal Dutch Shell, I believe it was called, was the main oil company at the time. There were a few other oil companies as well, but I feel like Shell has been like at the forefront of this whole thing. They were laying pipelines, they were, they set up their manufacturers, their factories, producing oil and all of that. And essentially what was happening was the oil spillages in the rivers, so like they couldn't fish, they couldn't drink the water, the crops and stuff were no longer growing, they were all dying, and as a result of that, people started to develop all kinds of illnesses. Again, you've taken the livelihood of these people because they can no longer fish, they can no longer farm. Then you think of perhaps the end products of the farming and the fishing, like the market women, people who were selling and exchanging these goods for different reasons. They no longer had the business that they once thrived on. So a lot of poverty was also in the area. So this was a massive issue, and this it still is.
Yeah, till today.
Till today, and I think that is the irony, if I can use that word, of it. Just of we speak of Ken Saro and what happened back in the 1950s, 1960s, and even the 90s, but till today, the effects of it.
That's what's so tragic. It's like I'm reading this stuff and I'm like, nothing's changed.
Literally, nothing has changed. And despite, we're gonna come back to like the efforts that have been made, post Ken's death, and even all the things that he tried to achieve in his lifetime, and see has there been any progress. But Ken was particular, and this is one thing that is interesting. Like, I don't know what your take is on it, but the way Ken approached the situation, right? The kind of strategy that he devised and the way he went about it with his community of protesting against these issues and standing up and fighting for the rights of the people. It was just, this is why, like, education is so important. And you need to have people, I wouldn't say it was a man ahead of his time. Like, it was just the kind of man that you need in your community. People who are going to stand up, people who are going to...
Respectable
man, definitely. Because what he did was, every protest they had was peaceful. And then he created this movement, I believe it was called Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People.
Yeah.
So it was known as MOSOP. And essentially, it was just this movement to defend the environmental and human rights of the people. And what he did was he wrote a bill, there was a Bill of Rights of what they were fighting for. So it was a very strategic, very well thought through campaign. It wasn't just like, one person just woke up one day and was like, oh, I've had enough, and it wasn't militant or anything like that.
It was proper organisation.
It was organised, very, very much so. And the things that they demanded for was they were demanding for increased autonomy for the Ogoni people.
Yeah.
Because essentially, like, Shell just came through and took over with the support of the military government, obviously. They were demanding for a fair share of the proceeds of oil that was extracted for Ogoni development. And I feel like even that demand, the irony of the fact that you can come into a place, you can exploit it to the extent that you don't even feel like... So now we're talking about like corporate social responsibility. And because these organizations or industries, they're foreign companies as well. One of the things that Ken was saying is half of the things they did in Ogoni land, they would not dare
do in their own land.
Do it in their own country.
No, but that's a key marker of like neo-colonial, neo-imperialist behavior. So Nigeria's independent, quote unquote, and you have this large foreign national company coming in, and as I mentioned in the Abacha episode, Abacha's activities and atrocities and corruption and philandering of all Nigeria's money,
resources,
it's not in a vacuum. I spoke about that in the last episode, and this is an example of that, right? Abacha was enabling Shell, and his regime was working very closely with Shell to exploit that region, but then also they were working very closely together to try and quiet and shut Ken Saro-Wiwa down. And that's what's also really sinister about Shell's involvement in Ken Saro-Wiwa's story. Because they weren't blind to the behavior of the Abacha regime. They knew that Abacha committed human rights abuses, and they very they would tell Abacha and the regime, like, you need to sort this situation out because you're risking the economic
growth and whatnot. And I think that the thing to point out also is that, you know, Ken's activism started way before Abacha came into power. So, but the common factor is the fact that it was a military government that was always in power, because, you know, we had 32 years or so of military government or military regime before our actual democracy. So yes, I think Abacha's regime was just like I don't know what you want to call it. It was just like the cap of what capped it all, and where it just became totally, because Ken was able to kind of like carry on his activism. You know, he was traveling abroad to speak about these issues, but just to kind of like continue some of the demands that he was making. So they were asking for fair share of the proceeds. They were also asking for protection of the environment and the ecology from further degradation, and they were asking for reparation as well of the harm that had been done to the health of the community. And I was just looking at those requests, and I was like comparing it to like just the sort of agenda that is being pushed in today in our community now, where, you know, everything's about the environment, it's about the community, it's about the...
You mean local to Nigeria, or like the global conversation?
The global conversation now is about, you know, environmental, this and that, let's save the planet, and all of this. And this were literally things that Ken Saro-Wiwa was saying, what you're doing is affecting our environment, and it has a repercussion, because people are dying of cancer, they're dying of all sorts of ailments, like, you know, respiratory ailments and all kinds. So he was asking for these things, and to think that these companies, these national organizations found those demands to be a threat to their operation. It's like, it's just the effrontery for me, because they're making so much money from oil. Everybody is like having their piece of the cake, like, you know, everyone is sharing, except the people from whom you actually came to bake you got all your ingredients to bake the cake from them, but they're not getting a piece of it. It's tragic. It is tragic, you know. But Ken's manifesto, the MOSOP movement, it was a very non-violent. So Ken was very particular as well about making sure that it would be a non-violent campaign, and everything. And he went to the United Nations to address them. Did you have any opinion about?
I think what the testament to his campaign is the ability to garner like international interest and support, especially in the darker moments of his campaign and his treatment. You know, you had major world leaders, you know, British Prime Minister, even the Queen. I mean, that's another conversation, but even the Queen commenting, you know, on the imprisonment that the Ogoni 9 had faced. And I think it's a great thing that he was able to gain that support, and even pass that work on, and his son taking on that work as well, to continue putting pressure on the Nigerian government and Shell as well. And I think that that's something that's really key as well. And like, it's not just holding governments to account, but there was a concerted effort to hold Shell accountable. And obviously decades later, they were held accountable. And I mean, they claim that they were held accountable and told to pay, I think hundreds of millions in today's
800 million, I think 850 million over a period of 5 years.
Yeah.
Starting from 2018, but at the last time I checked, they've only paid like 380 or something. So yeah, but it's right what you were saying, because you know he really did capture the international audience, and I think one thing he did also very strategically was kind of linking the exploitation to genocide. And once you hear genocide, you know what that is like. You know, the United Nations, Amnesty International, your ears are like standing there thinking, because I imagine that Shell have, you know, turned a kind of like willful ignorance to the effects of what they were doing.
Yeah.
And when you start to put it in terms of genocide, it kind of paints a different picture.
It's very difficult to ignore.
It's very difficult to
because
ignore.
Especially what you associate with genocide. You know, when it's that's a strategy that even like Malcolm X, you know, was starting to purport. There's like actually that the struggle that African Americans and the abuse and brutality that they were facing, that is a form of genocide, because no other race is experiencing that. But yeah, that language of genocide, you know, especially you associate it with the persecution of Jewish people, and people will always say never again, never again. So now you're drawing on that language, that rhetoric. And that was a powerful thing.
That was a very powerful language to introduce into the campaign.
And it's true, I think.
It is true.
It's true.
It is very true. And I think, unfortunately, the thing I was thinking was, it's very difficult because, I mean, again, census and all that stuff, I don't know, Nigeria's not very great at... I don't think we've had a very good way of keeping account of how many people have actually died from this. So you can't be like, oh, since 1960 to 2021, the so number of people have died as a result of the oil exploitation and everything that happened in Ogoni land till today. You can't put a number to it. And I guess when you don't have that sort of statistic to like back up what you're saying, it's difficult to kind of garner that imagery, that image of seriousness and the level of the consequences of what's happening. So you can't put numbers of human lives that have been affected by these things, but many people were dying. To think it was a small community, was a small community, a relatively small community. It affected many people, and it had a real ripple effect. But so Ken was pushing for corporate accountability for their actions, and he basically accused them for hiding behind a corrupt government. Which was what you were saying earlier. They were hiding behind a corrupt government, and they were violating local and international laws. But it's one of those things where, like I mentioned earlier, you can go to someone else's country and do as you please, but you know that would never work in your own country, or even not even in your own country, but internationally, that wouldn't run, you know. And he actually published a book that was called Genocide in Nigeria, the Ogoni Tragedy. And I just wish like these books would be more available. Like I just know he wrote a book because I've done my research into that, but I wouldn't know where to get a copy of that book. Listeners, if you know, let us know if you have if you have access to a copy of the book. it would be good to kind of like just read the thoughts of these people, you know, what they, I guess, yeah, there's some articles that have been published online now and, you know, all that stuff, but it's just the accessibility of these things. Like, you know, I should still be able to go on Amazon and publish, and maybe you can actually, I haven't actually checked, but again, yeah. But yeah, so yeah, it was just talking about how insensitive and condescending the oil companies were, and he accused them of racist business practices.
Well, it's all racist. I shouldn't laugh. It's not funny. But I mean, you know, it's. Sorry, you continue.
No, because I feel like, so not only was it using genocide, so this is like, you know when they say that, oh, someone is woke, like, you know, there's certain words you start to like throw into like the conversation.
Yeah, that didn't start today.
That didn't start, but this was not even a question of being woke. Like, he was woke from time, like, if you want to use that word woke, but he was just very aware of what was happening. And he accused them of racist business practice, and you think, well, what does oil exploitation have to do with racism? But essentially, the double standard that these oil companies were practicing, he was essentially saying, if the people in that community were white people, or European people, or white people basically, would you still do what you were doing?
No.
So
it wouldn't have been able to actually, that's an interesting question, because there's all sorts of like wicked environmental crises that happen in the West as well. I think of like in the US and Flint, and there's like a water crisis going on there. But I mean, to the level of degradation, to the degree that it's happened, and to how long it's taken to get some form of like justice or economic environmental justice.
Exactly.
It's been very slow.
Totally, because I think whilst we all recognise and acknowledge the fact that, you know, all kind of injustices happen all around the world, even to white people and black people and all kinds of, you know, people of all races, I guess the difference sometimes is how much you have to shout to get your voice heard if you're part of a particular group, as opposed to if you're part of a different group, you know? So
the tools that you have at your disposal to confront and challenge these massive powers. It's very different.
And I think that was a thought that was very prominent in Ken's messages. Just highlighted the fact that you guys are doing in this country what you would not do in a Western country.
And we need to continue using that language. And harkening back to that rhetoric. And I know that there are still organisations that do. But yeah, it's not to be complacent, because that stuff is still...
It's still happening.
It's still happening.
Definitely. Right, so we've kind of like established the seriousness of the issue, what the issues were. So how did things then... So, you know, Ken was still able to travel, he was able to write his articles, he was able to engage international communities and all that stuff. And then things started to kind of go downhill for him, essentially, when Abacha came into power. Which is, I think, the crux of the matter here, and how we're linking Ken Saro-Wiwa to Abacha. Actually, just the figures that were reported show that more than 500,000 local people who relied, you know, more than 500,000 people relied on their farming and fishing for survival. So we're talking about numbers. So now we don't have the exact figures, but you think 500,000, but sometimes those numbers are underreported. So you'd be thinking probably 1 million or so for a very, you know, for a relatively small community. And actually the figures also says that between 1976 and 1991, they had nearly 3,000 oil spills. That's like, you can't, if you have oil spillages in your river, it's just like, what are people going to drink? What are they going to cook with? And I think I really want to paint a picture of the tragedy
and enormity
of the tragedy as well. Actually, you know what? I was on Amazon Prime. There's a film that people can watch. It's called Oloibiri.
Okay.
Oloibiri is essentially telling the story. So Oloibiri is the first town where they found oil well.
Yeah.
That was exploited in Delta State as well.
Okay, I need to watch that.
And it was telling exactly this story, but it was also looking at the repercussions and the effect of what happened years later. So it was a kind of a story of the older man who was there at the time when things were happening, and then from the view of it wasn't his son, but it was like someone, maybe his nephew or something, who is now like a young, maybe like a man in his 30s or 40s, who is still fighting. So like say someone from Ken's generation and someone in modern in this generation trying to like address what has happened. So I thought we need more films like this. It was decently executed.
See, you're always getting like film or recommendations on this pod, so stay tuned. We'll have some more for you.
we'll have. There's more where that came from. So Oloibiri is Oloibiri.
Don't worry, we'll put it in the show notes.
Down, of course. What am I even doing? Yeah. So I recommend watching that just to kind of get a glimpse of some of the difficult conversations that were happening. So then came in Abacha in 1993. And I mean, Abacha's regime, we've talked about it last episode, it was just on a different level of corruption, unruliness, everything that you don't want as a country, basically. And so when Abacha came into power, things got really bad for the MOSOP movement. And he essentially, because when the militaries take control, they kind of like spread themselves into places where they think there's unruliness and people are not conforming to what they expect them to be. So he sent the military to Ogoni land, and there was a lot of riots. There was a lot of protesting, and all that stuff. And I think what had happened then was that some Ogoni chiefs were murdered.
4.
We don't know.
I read it was 4.
I said some. 4 Ogoni chiefs were murdered. Yeah. 4 of them were murdered. But then it's interesting because like they were opponent of what Ken Saro-Wiwa was doing, and I think this is the other thing as well. When you have like when you have an issue in your community, the importance of oneness, of everyone, of unity, like everyone knowing that this is an issue. It's not a case of maybe no. Clearly, people are dying. Clearly, your rivers are polluted. There's environmental pollution. What's there to oppose? But you would find that even with what you might think is so glaring, an injustice, there's always going to be division. And I think that's part of like the problem as well, why many things don't really get resolved as quickly as they should, or with this, or they don't get the same kind of attention or the level of vim that it should have. Because if you imagine like all these Ogoni chiefs, all of them were all back in the cause and everyone was like fighting for the same thing, it's harder to like divide when you know that people are stuck together. But anyway, so these Ogoni chiefs were basically opponents of Ken Saro-Wiwa. So you think, why would anyone want to kill them? Because at this point, they should be like pally with the government or the military rulers and all that stuff. But they were murdered. They were brutally murdered, according to the report, actually. And then the question then became, who killed them?
And guess who was blamed? Our very own.
Ken Saro-Wiwa.
Yeah.
Ken and his colleagues were blamed for this murder. But then it was a bit. Is it a coincidence? Was it a coincidence? Because at the time when the Ogoni chiefs were killed, there were soldiers and army in the town as well, and so I want to say naturally there was a lot of activities
commotion
happening. There was
and
a lot
chaos.
of commotion and chaos taking place, and so people said that there appeared to be an ulterior motive to why those military rulers were there in the community in the first place. And then, a day after the Ogoni chiefs were killed, Ken Saro-Wiwa and his 8 colleagues were arrested and they were accused of murder. But then this is why we noted at the beginning, Ken was very much for peaceful protest.
So it doesn't
add up.
It doesn't add up with everything that he's been speaking about, his poetry, his speeches, his political writings, for then him to be convicted in some kangaroo court of murder and what's the word, international kind of viewers of I'm forgetting the word now, but anyway, people who were paying attention to the trial of the Ogoni 9, they were like, this is a sham. It
was so glaring.
It was so obvious.
Something was not right, and there was a conspiracy going on there somewhere. Because the manner and the way in which the chiefs were killed, they were hacked to death, and it's just all of this is not. There was no consideration for the history of how Ken had organized the protest and the way that just conducted themselves. With the activism and stuff. So, but if you're hell bent on something, you try to. If you want to frame somebody for murder and you have the power to do so without any consequence, then you just go ahead and do it. And I think that was what people believed happened.
But I just think it's even embarrassing. How can you think, what was the point of even having this tribunal or whatever it is of Ken? You were determined to kill this man. So let's not pretend that you were trying to go through some decent judicial process.
But then I guess, and it wasn't Abacha really cared that much or anything for process or or trying to figure out what really happened and trying to make sure that justice was served. He just saw this as an opportunity to achieve his own aims and his goals, because what had started to happen was that Shell had to pause their operation and it meant that they were losing money. And it's just the place of money and economic gain in a lot of world conflicts. You really think of the Iraqi war and all this stuff, and people say there's so many reasons that have been put forward for why all of these wars are happening, and oil has been at the center of a lot of it, some sort of economic gain and stuff. And that was pretty much what was happening at the time. And Shell was just somewhere there at the back, kind of just, they've had to pause their operations, and Abacha's that's not going to happen, we're going to get this sorted. And so, Ken's now in the frame, and his 8 colleagues, and it was a 17-month trial, actually. But I guess they were just in prison, and in that 17 months there was a lot of appeal from the international community, people just trying to appeal to Abacha's better side. But then also, I think the one thing to also kind of mention here is the accompanying. So we've talked about the pollution, we've talked about the sicknesses and things like that, but also the accompanying crimes, so to speak, because with the military going into Ogoni land, there were now reports of women being raped, people being murdered, and just a lot of, unruly behavior. But who are you going to attribute it to? You can't be like, oh yeah, the military came and they raped our women and girls. Who's gonna punish them? Who's gonna, So all of these things were also happening, and there's been a lot of, tragedy, in that sense. But yeah, so Ken was tried, but internationally it was clear that everything was politically motivated, and the Ogoni were like political prisoners. They were acknowledged as political prisoners because of their opposition to Shell. And what do you think Shell should have done at this time? Do you think Shell could have played any role in trying to ensure that they don't get killed, or just trying to appeal to Abacha?
That's an interesting question. Well, we know they shouldn't have. Well, could they have done more to stop the death of the Ogoni Nine? They shoulda, woulda, coulda, right? I think that's that's an interesting question. I mean, if Abacha was determined to, I guess their involvement and their encouragement of Abacha to deal with this situation means that they wouldn't have
exactly
they wouldn't have done anything to dissuade him from persecuting them. So, but obviously they're very influential. So that, I would say puppeteer, in the background.
Yeah.
I think as long as Abacha was benefiting and from the relationship with Shell, unfortunately the Ogoni Nine's fate, I think, would have remained
exactly, and that was it. And interestingly, they were tried in a military tribunal as opposed to the normal courts. So that already meant that they weren't even going to get the justice that they deserved. And there was also reports of people being bribed to testify against them. And those people came out later to say, they were paid 30,000 naira and they were offered houses and jobs with Shell to give false testimony in the presence of Shell's lawyer.
And it's just, even when I think about it, I just think of Shell still even has a presence in the country today, and it's infuriating.
Yeah,
it's really infuriating.
Yeah. Do you think, I don't know, the other day I was driving past, and I drove past a Shell. I was going to get petrol or something, I think, and I drove past Shell, and I was like, no, I'm going to go further down and get my petrol. And I think, is there, I guess people can, sometimes you hear, how R. Kelly's been cancelled because of, it's been cancelled by a lot of people, they're not listening to his music anymore, and all that stuff. Do you think there's a way in which Nigerians can be we're going to hold this company accountable by withholding our services, our money?
I think, we're talking about, these people have hundreds of millions of dollars to deal with this situation. I think it's what is needed is the political education of the people, and to be united against such a powerful entity. And then but the idea of not using their goods, is we're still heavily reliant on them. And I think before, I don't know which comes first, you're boycotting Shell, or are we going to make sure that we're having political leaders at the federal and local level that have actually, they're committed to a higher cause, that they're committed to serving the people rather than themselves. I think that's the key thing here. It's people who have some, you know, the consciousness and are truly committed to pushing the nation of Nigeria forward. I mean, the idea of like boycotting a company. I mean, at the end of the day, Shell is even employing Nigerians right now. Exactly. So it's like, I'm not trying to take anybody's job away from them, you know?
Yeah, but I guess individuals can make their own decisions and be like, this is how I feel about this particular situation. You know, there's so many other... I mean, at the end of the day, all these oil companies, they're somehow accomplices in this whole situation, because many of them, it's just maybe there were smaller players in the game, but they were also somehow involved. So it's like, how many people are you going to boycott, especially for such a essential service, right? But yeah, so I mean, that is something for people to decide. I'm sure I've bought petrol in Shell since then, but so they were tried and they were convicted of murder, and they were sentenced to death by hanging. So that's such a crucial way to die. That's such a horrible... I mean, there's no good way to die, but that is just like...
Yeah, hearing that does break my heart, and thinking about it, it does sadden me. But we don't want to like end this podcast on such a sad note. I suppose what are some of the key lessons or hopeful things you've taken?
I think a lot of good things have come out of it, because firstly you need somebody to speak up and to garner enough attention from the right people. And I think with the death of the Ogoni 9, I believe Nigeria was actually removed from the Commonwealth or so for a few years. And also what has happened was people have taken Shell to court, like a group of, families and all that stuff. Shell's been taken to court. The Amnesty International has been involved on some level, and there's been some reparation. Whether it's been enough or whether enough has been done is a different question entirely. But I think little drops make an ocean, right? You have to start from somewhere, and I believe that the voice where Ken stopped, many people have picked up the baton.
Absolutely.
They've continued the race even till today. And I think that is that's significant.
Yeah, and I think for me, definitely keeping the international, like utilizing or mobilizing people in the diaspora, and those of us in the diaspora who, the reality is we have more privileges. We especially in the West, we have more comforts and safety, so to speak, where we can speak up and campaign and make sure that these stories, and not only stories, but very real issues are spoken about. I mean, the Delta region is still a very difficult place to live in. The pollution in that area is horrible.
Even though oil production ceased like over 20 years ago now.
The impacts are still being felt to this day as we're recording this. So I'm glad that we've had the opportunity to raise this and bring awareness to it for those who don't know.
And I think Ken still doesn't have his rightful position in Nigeria's history. Like, yes, people acknowledge him as this environmental activist and all of this and that, but I think unfortunately Ken is not the only victim here. Many historical figures haven't yet found their rightful place in Nigeria's history and be recognized for the significance of the work that they did.
So we are recognizing him here.
We
are recognizing him here, and I think that's another important thing to acknowledge as well, is that we need to recognize ourselves. First, we need to recognize and respect ourselves, so that we can carry that energy towards other people, which is what Ken Saro-Wiwa did you know.
Yeah. And can I just end this with a quote that he gave just before, a quote from a speech he gave just before he died. He said, "There are people who commit time and energy to fight this one evil among so many others predominating worldwide. If they do not succeed today, they will succeed tomorrow. We must keep on striving to make the world a better place for all of mankind, each one contributing his bit in his or her own way." And I think, yeah, on that note,
thank you for listening to this week's podcast, Once Upon a Niger. I'm Evelyn.
And I'm Lara. Until next time.
Goodbye.
Bye.